in our follow-up, but it is showing the path of water to our pipes, basically. So mostly from the Russian River by way of Lake Sonoma and various mechanisms, storage tanks throughout the way, but also from the Pillsbury Reservoir and Eel River up in County by way of Potter Valley. So here in Petaluma, the water that comes from our taps comes from the Russian River, but we're actually not in the Russian River watershed. We're in the Petaluma River watershed. Has anyone seen this graph before? Excellent, a couple people have. So I'll share this one out in the follow-up email as well. I highly recommend getting to know your watershed just to give you the lay of the land and some context. But we've got headwaters up here, the confluence of a few creeks. We've got various ephemeral tributaries that come down off Sonoma Mountain hills and into Petaluma Marsh areas, the biggest salt marsh left in San Pablo Bay, broader ecosystem. And so you might notice there's a decent amount of straight lines in blue here, which is not the way that water likes to move on its own accord. It's a product of the way that we've developed the land, that we've changed ecosystems through processes like deforestation and straightening of water courses. And essentially what that means is we've shortened the journey of water from cloud to its outflow, in this case, the bay, and in the case of the Russian River, the ocean, right? Water is spending less time in our watershed, which has a bunch of compounding problems. I could talk about that for a really long time, but I'm going to pass it over to someone who is more succinct than I am and show a video. Oh, what? Sorry, if you all can bear with us, we are trying this hybrid programming for the first time. Try to reshare my screen. Apologies. You have it, Ava? Okay. And just enable sound. Thank you for your patience. Okay. This is a wonderful video that sums up what I'm driving at.
When we think about climate change, we tend to think about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warming the planet. Carbon is so central to our thinking about the climate that many other important aspects are excluded from the conversation. One of these things is water. Water is actually the dominant greenhouse gas, but its global effects are difficult to measure because it doesn't spread out evenly in the atmosphere like carbon does. Its effect on temperature also depends on the many forms it takes. When it takes the form of a haze, it has a warming effect. When it takes the form of clouds, it has a cooling effect, except for at night, in which it has a subtle warming effect. Since atmospheric water is hard to model, it tends to get ignored. But temperature is not the only important aspect of the climate here. If the climate can be warm or cold, the climate can also be wet or dry. The rampant rise of floods and droughts of our time are said to be caused by climate change, but really they are climate change. While temperature does have some effect on rainfall, floods and droughts are primarily caused by disruptions to the hydrological cycle. We tend to think of the water cycle this way. Rain falls, water evaporates, condenses into clouds, and repeats. But this is only part of the picture, since a lot more happens underground. Healthy soil is like a sponge that soaks up a lot of water. Some of it is taken up and stored by plants, and some of it percolates deep down into aquifers. This groundwater wells up and feeds springs and streams, which allows even more life to thrive. There's then much more water to evaporate from the saturated ground or to transpire through plants. This abundance of water vapor allows for more consistent rainfall. So what happens if we cut down the forest, plow the grasslands, and expose the soil? Without trees or plants to buffer the rain, the heavy downpour compacts the soil. The water can't soak down into the compacted ground, so almost all of it stays above ground and we have a flood. Almost all this water runs off, carrying loads of topsoil with it. And when the rain stops, the little water there is left evaporates very quickly, leaving the ground compact and dry. This lack of percolation depletes the groundwater over time, so it can't feed the streams, which dry up. Now there's no water in the land to feed rain clouds, and we have a drought. If a rainstorm does come, it just creates another flood and worsens the subsequent drought. Instead of consistent rainfall, we have a flood-drought cycle. Fortunately, it is possible to reverse this trend. There are ways to regenerate ecosystems and restore the water cycle pretty rapidly while feeding people in the process. Making subtle changes to the land's topography can slow the flow of water, allowing more of it to soak into the ground and be used by plants. Plants with deep roots help break up the compacted soil, allowing water to percolate deeper. Everyone has a place in reversing the climate crisis. Whether you're working to protect healthy ecosystems, regenerate damaged ones, or just helping yourself or your neighbor depend a little less on industrial agriculture, you are helping the Earth heal.
All right, Ava, are we getting screen over there? There we go. All right, excellent. So we're looking at sort of vicious cycles where when we disrupt the ecosystem, these problems compound, where we can have the virtuous cycle of making positive impacts, the benefits have this relationship with one another where they build and build. So what that can look like in action on the negative side, this is the big storm we had almost exactly a year ago on the street that I live in Sebastopol, where we're having tons of runoff coming down from a major roadway up here, going down onto the dirt road I live on, really carving out this channel alongside the roadway that is eroding the soil that these trees are rooted in, which undermines both their health but also their stability. As the trees decline and die, we lose the ability of their roots to hold the soil in place. And again, we're seeing this vicious cycle effect of the soil quality going down, localized temperatures going up, and so on. So I do have one last video to share that can show, I don't know why it doesn't want to share the screen that way, but that's okay. What a healed water cycle can look like.
Moisture from the coast. The rainfall. The sun evaporates liquid water into vapor, carried inland by the wind. Microscopic organisms growing within the leaves of trees flow into the sky as the trees transpire. These organisms are hygroscopic, meaning they attract water, concentrating vapor into droplets, forming clouds and then rain. The phase change of water, from gas to liquid, creates a big change in volume and a drop in pressure. Trees and vegetation transpire water into the air, increasing the humidity and lowering the temperature. The low pressure created acts like a vacuum, drawing in more moisture from the coast. The rain falls onto cool, shaded soil and infiltrates rapidly, following roots deeper into the earth. The earth's body is hydrated with blood. Water returns as pure springs, feeding streams, rivers, and lakes with cool, fresh water throughout the year. Biomes on Earth function as living, breathing organisms. They respire water and create climate. Ecosystems act as the Earth's organs, circulating water inland in a system called the biotic pump. Roughly half of the rainfall we receive comes from water evaporated and transpired locally. This process is a feedback loop. The more water that enters the cycle, the more life Earth can support on land. This natural water cycle results in a balanced and productive climate.
All right. That'll be our last screen change, so it should run smoothly from here with the Zoom screen share. Okay. So, kind of summing that up, our current paradigm, the way we look at water, it's almost as if rainwater is like it's a nuisance. This is the way that many of our homes' lots are designed. They're sloped downward towards the road to hasten water off the landscape. This house doesn't even have gutters, right? Water's just coming straight off the roof. The pavement, it's rushing downhill on the pavement into storm drains, collecting all this erosive power and feeding into that negative feedback that we're talking about. So like the more drought, the more flooding, right? And it compounds. Whereas where we want to be, slowing down water's journey through any watershed, even if we just think of our house and our landscape as a watershed. We want to slow down the process of water getting from the high point, my laser here, down to its outflow. So we're using all kinds of techniques. We've reduced our pavement a lot. We're channeling water from the gutters into a rainwater storage tank, which overflows to a basin or a rain garden. We've got a few types of rain garden picture, right? So what we're seeing here is what we call slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, rather than pipe it, pave it, and pollute it. So I'm gonna just touch on this for time's sake, but if you're curious, you go on YouTube and you just type in the phrase "greening the desert," you'll end up on a playlist that shows what water restoration work can do on the macro scale. It's really inspiring stuff. I can include some links in the follow-up email. So people often talk about having a lighter impact on the environment, right? Like humans, reduce your footprint, reduce your impact. That doesn't land very well with me. I believe that humans are supposed to have an impact on the environment. I want to have a profound one. I just want it to be positive, right? Just like a beaver is manipulating their ecosystem, right? My question is, how can we be less like a bulldozer and more like a beaver, right? We're working in our local zone, we're slowing down water, we're using materials we source from nearby. They're also a lot cuter than a bulldozer. So just some quick examples before we jump into the nitty-gritty of what slow it, spread it, sink it, store it can look like in action. So this is the Kavanaugh Center on G and 8th for you local Petaluma folks. That was installed in 2009, which is when this picture on the left is from. The landscape was sheet mulch, like we were talking about earlier, but they also put in a type of rain garden or swale. We call it a swale trail because the area in the middle here where water collects is mulched, and that's actually the pathway for people to walk through to harvest and maintain plants. It's kind of difficult to see in this picture, but on the right, we're maybe 2 years into this garden, and this is actually completely filled with water. The water comes off the roof of the Kavanaugh Center. It fills up a pretty large rainwater tank, and the overflow goes into these swale trails. That water will drain over the course of maybe 2 days, and it keeps it on site for the plants for much longer. It keeps that soil really healthy and hydrated. Another local example on the left, this is at Petaluma City Hall. Similar situation where we've got rain tanks coming off another sizable roof. These all are plumbed together, so they fill at the same time. And when they are all full, the water reaches the top of this pipe and flows into a pretty traditional small size rain garden here. You can see the laser. It comes down this rock fortified path, and as it fills, it will overflow into this drain that, like our example outside that we looked at, moves water to a different part of the landscape. And it's been protected by rocks to keep sediment and organic matter from blocking that drain. On the right, we have a curb cut, different kind of rain garden. These are really popular in, if you ever visit Tucson, Arizona, you might see hundreds of these, thanks to Brad Lancaster. Water that's coming down the street, as you'll see in any rain event, pretty much anywhere in America, it has all that velocity and volume, will enter where the curb has been cut or cored. Sometimes you just drill a hole through the curb. It will fill up this depression, and when it's filled, the movement of the water will cause it to circle and overflow back into the street. But really just slowing down all that velocity. More sophisticated example, this is the Petaluma campus of the JC. A really large rain garden is not a pond. This is just a day after a really large rain event. All this water will drain out in less than 72 hours. It's going to quite a few plants that are in the area and keep that soil nice and healthy. So while a rain garden can be something that's very technically engineered and sophisticated, it certainly doesn't have to be. Sometimes when I talk to people about rain gardens, I tell them it's just a strategic hole, right? It's like a ditch that you dig that's job is to slow down and retain water. So while this wouldn't be my recommendation, if you went out into your landscape with spade and just dug little shallow crescent-shaped depression, you'd be slowing down the water. It's not the most strategic way to do so, but it could be that simple. And people have been doing this around the world for a long time. In the Western Sahels, and this is an example from the country of Burkina Faso, they have a technique called zai that are just holes in the ground that they backfill with some compost or manure so that it retains water and can little wells of water for plants to grow. It makes a profound difference from this flat landscape that's very dry, where water would otherwise sheet and erode as it goes. All right, so rain gardens. We don't need to worry too much about the labels here. I just really like this imagery. Components are pretty straightforward. We've got water comes off the roof, the gutter and downspout. There are many ways you can direct water into a rain garden, but at the end of the day, it's a shallow depression or intentional topography that is catching rainwater. It has designated inflow, it has a designated outflow for when it fills up too much, and it's providing all kinds of benefits. We'll go through, I have one slide before that. Planted with native plants that are going to filter out pollutants and be able to withstand that day or two or even three of really wet feet and long periods without water. So just to show how simple a rain garden in this style can be, this is our programs director, Brianna, lives here in town, dug this rain garden last year. This is an in-process shot, but it's quite small. The size of your rain garden is partially just dependent on how much size you have to work with. But she and her family knocked this out in just a couple hours, probably less. She's got her spade, just dug this out, leveled it, or more than half the way there. We went over some of the kind of macro benefits. Why do we want to do this from ecosystem perspective or from a climate perspective? But when we zoom in, what a rain garden is doing, one, it's filtering pollutants from runoff. So a lot of people, either their roof or their driveway will be the source of catchment for water that's going into their rainwater. All kinds of nasty stuff on a driveway, right? The car's going on it, you're going to have oil, other chemicals. As they enter the rain garden, roots of those plants will do an exceptional job of filtering contaminants, keep them from entering larger watershed, as they will do if they run off into streams or creeks, right? Provides habitat for birds, insects, or mostly because when we're planting rain gardens, we advise using all native plants. There are others that are non-native that will work well, but we really like native plants in rain gardens. It beautifies your landscape. It provides a lot of intrigue, lots of color and size, just like any landscape design. And then again, we've got the larger benefits of recharging the groundwater, which will keep your plants healthier. It'll keep your soil hydrated, which will keep your plants healthy. And it'll reduce flooding, erosion. The benefits really continue and continue. This is a graphic from Washington State University that shows, I really like the way that it demonstrates kind of this cross section down at the bottom, as well as the different levels of a rain garden. So a rain garden is not like a pool. You're not digging straight down, just having this flat-sided containment area for water to pond in. It's almost always going to be a gradual sloping down. So you have a layer at the bottom that we call the low zone or the floodplain that is going to be filling with water and completely underwater in a rain event. That's where you're going to have those plants that are going to tolerate having really wet roots without being stressed out by it. We'll have sort of a second layer that some people call the terrace level or level, where you have plants that will really benefit from having that extra water, don't want to have wet feet the same way. And then on top, on our edges, a lot of rain gardens will have berms, mounds to contain water. Grow plants there, including ground covers that'll help keep those mounds from eroding. So you can have a lot of variety, different types. If you see on the bottom here what that looks like, we have like our ponding surface and our compost amended soil down here. Got some rushes or native grass actually halfway underwater. They're wetland or marsh plants. This is how they evolved. So speaking of plants, I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. I have an excellent resource that we're going to send out in the follow-up email to both folks who are here in person and those online. That gives you many, many options of plants to work with. But figure you might see some names you recognize or some pictures that look familiar just to get your imagination going for what the possibilities are. These are our low zone plants. Again, we're looking at a lot of grasses, maybe some iris. Not typically going to have much in the way of trees down low, even if you have a large rain garden, but willow species are pretty compatible with the low zone. The mid-level, again, the focus here is how do we benefit pollinators? How do we benefit birds? Native species that have either flowers or fruits that will support it. You'll notice maybe that there are a couple of edible plants on this list, or medicinal plants, depending how you use them, like elderberry and hazelnut. It's really important to know that plants grown in a rain garden are typically not things that you'll eat because they're filtering all those pollutants and taking them up into their biomass. And you don't want to have whatever remains of motor oil in your hazelnuts. It's not to say it's completely forbidden. You just kind of have to know your circumstances and what contaminants your runoff might be picking up. But as a general rule of thumb, it's better to think habitat rather than edible landscape. Certainly not growing a veggie garden in your rain garden, not growing an apple tree. And in our high zone, ground covers, again, if you've got berms, they need to be at least twice as wide as they are tall. And we want to do everything we can to keep them from eroding, because as water comes up the slope, it's going to want to pull soil with it as it recedes or as it pushes through. But we want ground covers, especially ones that will grow kind of quickly, that'll sink their roots into that berm and really hold it together. There's a lot of overlap between, especially the mid, plants that are good in the mid can often do well in both the high zone and the low zone. So for example, monkey flower, which if you were looking through any of our plant cards back there, you might have seen, it can thrive in either the mid or the high zone. It just doesn't want the wet. Out here, we can start looking at more tree species, especially medium-sized trees that aren't going to be getting their roots drowned or picking up quite as much of that pollutant material. And then beyond your berms, and actual canopy trees, the vine maple, they'll really enjoy having that extra water nearby. Before we jump into design, you have to figure out if this is actually going to be a good fit for your landscape. Rain gardens work in some form in most situations, but it's obviously not going to be the case 100% of the time. So on the topic of trees, you don't want to have to dig in such a way that will disturb the roots of trees. I'll probably touch on that a few times in this presentation, but trees, especially native trees, already do a really good job of filtering pollutants and retaining water. So you certainly don't want to harm a tree that's doing that job for the sake of a rain garden that doesn't exist yet. You want to pay attention to how much sun you get, the area you're thinking. Sunny is great, especially if you have clay soil, because the sun is going to help to an extent prevent having water that doesn't drain. right? We want our rain garden to drain within 72 hours so that it's not a vector of things like mosquitoes. We don't want stagnant water for too long. So if you've got clay dominant soil, like I imagine some of us do have, if you've got a sunny spot, that's just one more ally in the project of keeping. That said, if you have shade, that doesn't mean you can't have a rain garden. You just might have to dig it shallower and wider. This is another thing I'm going to say a bunch of times. Please call 811 before you dig. You know this mark. Even if you're not digging straight into a line, it's not a good idea to have a bunch of standing water your electrical line. It's important to know what kind of soil you have on that note of clay. We'll talk about some really quick and easy soil tests. Sandy soils drain fast, clay soils do not. You can manipulate that to an extent, but it's important to know that you can't fully change soil type. List of definite don'ts and setbacks. We're going to send out the presentation, so you'll see all these again. Don't feel like you need to scribble them down. I'm not going to talk about all of them. But again, we want to avoid damaging things like foundations. We want to avoid erosion, so you don't want a very steep slope. We don't want to introduce more contaminants into groundwater, and we also don't want to bring in groundwater to something that we're hoping drains. If you've got a high groundwater table and you dig down and put a bunch of water there, it's not going to drain in 7 hours. Slope is an important one. I know, Diana, you mentioned you live on a hill, and it's Sonoma County, so a lot of people live on hills. The first thing to know is you got to be downhill where the water's coming from. Like, we don't want to do extra work or have to use a pump to get water into our rain garden. Your landscape is flat or 5% or less grade, which don't know calculated slope. It's basically just how much elevation change there is over a given distance. You've got 20 feet of horizontal distance, 2 feet elevation change. You've got a 10%. There are lots of easy ways to figure this out at home. So if you're above 5%, you're going to have to do a little more work when you install your rain garden to make sure that you're not eroding your hill away. And if you've got a slope of 10% or greater, you got to call in an expert. They may tell you that a rain garden is not your best bet, but they will probably have a good alternative. There are lots of earthwork rainwater harvesting systems that are really good on hills. Rain gardens just aren't necessarily the best one. So I saw a lot of nodding heads when I mentioned clay soil, so it sounds like a lot of us probably already know this, but there are some easy ways to figure out what kind of soil you have. And it's important to know how quickly water is draining on your soil. If it's taking longer than 72 hours, you've got poor soil, at least from a rain garden perspective. Probably isn't a good fit. So what you can do is just dig a hole that's your determined depth for your rain garden. Pretty much all rain gardens are going to be a ponding depth. So like the top surface to how high the water gets of either 6 or 12 inches. You'll dig a hole that deep, you'll fill it with water. Right now, this time of year, when we've had recent rains, you can just do it once. Fill it up, stick a ruler or a yardstick, whatever, a piece of PVC you've marked half-inch marks on, and start a timer and watch how quickly it drains. So if you dig it 12 inches down and it takes 12 hours to drain, you've got a drain of 1 inch per hour, which would be it. While you're digging it out and waiting, another easy test could be to just grab some of that soil and squeeze it in your hand. If it feels like you've got something you could make a bowl with, pottery, you've got really clay heavy soil. If it just crumbles immediately, you've got sand dominant soil. If it's somewhere in between, you're somewhere in between. You might have low. But it's important to think about this when you're sizing your rain garden. So again, I want to really impress on y'all that the size of your rain garden is to a large extent just up to what works for you. They're typically going to be 10 to 30% of the area that is contributing water to them. So however big your driveway is or however big your roof is, counting all the gutters that are contributing. 10 to 30% of that. That 1,000-foot roof might be 100 to 300 feet. It doesn't have to be. It could be smaller. It could be 1,000 feet. You know, it's a question of how much water you want to catch before you let it overflow to, you know, the rest of your landscape out to the storm. Kind of a general rule of thumb is you want to think of it as holding at least an inch of rainwater. We can talk through how to calculate that afterwards or via email if you like. But again, it's very forgiving. You know, if you dig your rain garden and it's overflowing, you should probably dig it bigger for the next rain. Really, the metric you're looking for is you want to get the water out of there in 72 hours. You don't want to have a bunch of erosion. Once you've got the size, you can think about the shape. Rain garden can be a rectangle or square. That's totally fine, especially if you've got, you know, like a suburban lot and the front yard is rectangular and you want to devote most of that space to catching rainwater. But I prefer personally these kind of curved edge shapes. It could be a circle, it could be kind of a kidney bean. Those kind of curves and edges have really nice aesthetic quality to them, but they're also have some interesting impacts ecologically rather than straight lines. So you'll need to think about where's the water coming from. For most of us, this will probably be either our roof or the driveway. We want to make the work easiest on us as we can. We want to have our inflow point be where the water is already coming from. We want to work with gravity. But again, if we're working with a lot of slope, we're going to want to slow the water down. So you can do that by either building up underneath your inflow if you're using something like a pipe, or if you're just using like a rocked channel or swale, you can put in extra rocks in the way. They're called check dams, just to slow the flow of water so it's not as a lot of rock here, the inflow and the outflow. Those are the weak points when it comes to erosion, where water is being directed, right? With overflow, ideally you're directing it into another basin, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily a rain garden. It could just be a shallow depression that maybe now that the water's been a little more filtered, you're something else. Plants that are a little more accustomed to not having their roots fully submerged in water, they'll only get wet if the first basin overflows. But you can also just direct your overflow back to where water was already flowing, because you're intervening, you're making a difference, you're doing a service to everyone who's downstream of you by slowing down that water filter. So even if at the end of your rain garden, water goes back to the storm drain, it's still a win. Just don't send it towards your neighbor's house, cause problems for their family. Okay. Once you figure out your design, you've thought through the plants that you want, where your inflow and outflow are. We'll talk a little bit more detail about those components in a couple minutes. You want to gather your tools and materials. This first list, these are choices. You could use any of these options. Just mark out where your rain garden is going to be. So we have this kind of fun shaped kids rug here. That'd be a great rain garden shape. You could mark it out with rope, landscape marking paint. My favorite is actually flour. Biodegradable, it's non-toxic, wash rain garden. And then if you don't dig perfectly, you're not going to have this neon orange paint on your landscape. Once you've marked it, again, call 811. You'll need digging tools. You might want a rake for once you've dug down your rain garden. You can use the rake to kind of scarify the surface so that the soil you put back in grits better. Gloves are great if you want. You'll need a level of some kind. It can be as simple as just like a straight level or a carpenter's level. If you're using a big rain garden, you might put it on a 2x4 that you've determined is straight. You just set it right on top. You might use a string level, or if you're fancy, a laser level. I will show what it looks like shortly as well. You're probably going to want compost. It's not completely necessary if you've already got healthy soil. It's going to boost your rain garden and your soil in general's ability to retain water, and it'll make your plants a lot healthier in the long run. Once your rain garden is completed, everything's planted, you're going to want to cover everything in mulch, and you'll need some round, at least 2-inch diameter stones or bigger rock that'll be erosion defense. That's your inflow and outflow. Probably want a tarp and a wheelbarrow for when you're removing soil, somewhere to put it. So it's not just a big pile, especially if you've got mulch on your landscape already. So this is the high level. We mark it, dig it, we create the inflow point where the water is coming in. We're going to first level the excavated bottom. So we're going to dig a little deeper the first time around, maybe as deep as 18 or 24 inches. We want to level that first. We're going to walk around it to not compact the soil, but to kind of tamp it down. We're not bringing a backhoe down there. Your feet are plenty enough. You're going to create the overflow. You're going to put in your soil back to that desired depth, which I think would be our 5. Probably amended with compost. There are places you can buy rain garden soil mix. It's more common in places that have really large amounts of rain, like Maryland, the East Coast, where rain gardens are also popular. But there, imagine a place nearby to be a little sandier to allow drainage. Put the soil back, you'll level that as well. You'll plant and you'll cover the soil with mulch. You might install drip irrigation because even though the plants we're putting in are natives, they'll need extra water the first couple years to get established. If we have years in the future with decent rainfall, it's possible, like I was saying with our garden outside, that this rain garden might be enough irrigation year round if you're catching it. So again, I just want to have this image with us of Brianna's really simple rain garden in progress, right? So we've excavated, maybe we got our soil here on a tarp, maybe we've already leveled. We're going to eventually be putting in rocks here of the inflow. It's a really great example. The rain garden here, we're starting 10 feet away, but it's really easy. We don't have to move water. Coming down downspout already. All we had to do, we're going to put rocks on our outflow as well. We may not plant in this one. We might just plant on the edges. We might just have gravel or mulch down here at the bottom. They'll still slow down and sink and benefit all the other plants around us. So this one, if you're a really detail-oriented person, this slide is for you. This is the landscape architect from Davis, based on his years of building rain gardens. This formula for best drainage and most aesthetically pleasing. So for every foot wide your rain garden is, your sides should not be, your depth should not go more than 3/4 of an inch. But this is a little more complex than I like to be. I'm more of like all right, if it's sandy, do my 12-inch depth. Most of the time I'm going to do a 12-inch depth for a rain garden anyway. When we're digging down, let's say we determine we wanted our 12-inch ponding surface that's going to hold a lot more water than the 6-inch surface. Again, we want to make sure that our sides are not steeper than that 2-to-1 ratio. So we want it nice and gradual so that our sides don't erode and our rain garden stays the shape we want it, and we're not accidentally reducing its ability to drain water or putting soil out into the watershed. Ideally, you're going to take the soil you excavate and reuse it, either building berms or somewhere else in your landscape. Just an important note, if your soil is sandy, it's not going to make a watertight berm. Water's going to go through it. It's not actually going to contain it. I imagine there are plenty of folks around Petaluma who would be more than happy to give you some clay soil. Converse of that is if you have clay soil, do not put sand in it. It makes sense intuitively, but if you mix sand with clay, you might get a concrete-like mixture. So the opposite of what we want. And then again, we want to tamp down the soil, but especially those berms. We might even line the berms with rocks if we're building up. And the reason we might build berms is if we're on a slope. So if you're on that slope of between 5 and 10%, you're going to have to do extra work. If it's flat or less than 5, you can just pick your depth and dig to it. And as long as you level the bottom, you don't have any problem. If you're on this slope that's relatively steep. Your best option, it says there's two, but in my opinion, your best option here is to do what we see in this diagram, which is dig out of the slope to a level point and use the soil you take out to make that berm. It involves a little more thought. You're going to have to make it level across its width. But in my opinion, it's going to do a lot better job of resisting erosion than the other option, which is if you just take the slope that we're working on, start at our downhill point, and dig down to our depth on that 2-to-1 ratio, and then dig into the hillside. You're gonna have to dig a heck of a lot more to get that level bottom. So yeah, just being conscious of time. If you have questions about slope, talk about them after, but I'm gonna move on ahead. Pretty straightforward, but if you've never used a level before, this is what it looks like. This is a carpenter's level. Some people call it a basic level or straight level, all kinds of names. You'll want to do this in a number of places, or like I said, if you've got a 2x4 or any straight board, you can lay it on top. As long as it's contacting the surface throughout its length, it'll give you an accurate representation. You want that level middle. Inflow and outflow. Back at our Petaluma City Hall example, there are a lot of ways you can get water from your catchment surface to your rain garden. People do really creative things. I've seen like elevated, like bamboo aqueduct style conveyances, or you can have a splash pad and just let the water run its course. You determine that it'll go in the right spot. Run PVC. Some people will actually convey water underground. That's a little more complex, so we're not going to deal more on that. What you do need to do, regardless, if your water's entering anywhere in your rain garden, you're going to have this rock barrier or reinforcement. Ideally, you're having washed rock, because if your rock is not clean, it's going to a lot of sediment with it, and that first rain that comes in, you just introduce a layer of sediment to your rain garden that will slow down the infiltration. It's great if you can get secondhand rock, but if you do, you should wash them off. And then again, if you're using a berm, you're going to want extra rock to keep everything in place for your outflow. And if you're on that berm, you want to extend that like rock bib or path at least 4 feet beyond where the slope ends, just to really prevent the water from digging out the backside of that berm and threatening to collapse. Okay, I think this is the last text slide. Once you're done, you need to wait for the first rain before you can tell if you did a good job. The most important thing is our step one. Did the water drain within 72 hours? If not, check for sediment buildup and other debris. If that's not there, you might just have to make it a little bigger, make it wider. Anytime after a storm, you want to check for erosion, especially at those weak points. You may need to make adjustments. Or like I mentioned earlier, the water might be coming in too hot, right? It might need to be slowed down. You want to replenish mulch anywhere there's bare soil or thin mulch. And again, water plants as needed. The first few years, you'll have more weeds than you will in later years. The plants are small, they can't compete with the weeds as well. When they're bigger and healthier, they will shade them out to an extent. There'll be less work. So just going to kind of blow through a few examples to respect everyone's time so we can get to some questions. A really lovely rain garden where looks like they haven't really planted much in zone 1, but all these plants in this tight space are benefiting. They used a gravel bottom rather than mulch. Works wonderfully as well. Got some fun before and afters to show you can do this in a pretty small area. In San Mateo County, they do a rebate for rain gardens, and the requirement is that your rain garden need only be 4% size of your catchment area, so long as you're catching from at least 300 square feet. But if you're quick at math, below that's 12 square feet. It's a pretty small area, and they'll pay you to do that. So it's effective even in the small scale. It's effective in a humongous scale as well. Here we've got a cool example where the inflow point is here and the water actually runs under the path. It's all rain garden as well. Another lovely front yard that's pretty much entirely been devoted to rain garden. All right, and then some quick housekeeping. We've got some other great events coming up. Next week, we've got a Spanish webinar on rainwater harvesting in barrels. This Saturday, we've got a garden tour at the Kavanaugh Center, which we showed the swale trails of in the beginning, as well as at our executive director, Trade Home Garden, which does a ton of really amazing rainwater harvesting strategies and had the first shower, tub, and bathroom sink gray water system in Northern California. It's because of that system that you can get a permit for it. So that would be a fun event. It's in partnership with Cool Petaluma. If you go, you'll get a free copy of his new book. And then we also have an upcoming maintenance day in the garden that we were in earlier this evening that Ava will be leading. It'll be a really fun time. It's a drop-in basis, kind of come for the parts that work for you at the time it works at all. Trayton's new book. Lot to say, but we're running out on time. So I would just encourage you to check it out on our website. It's a pretty inspiring work. Quick shout out to our sponsors. And then last, just thank you all for being here and being interested in rain gardens. If you appreciate the work that we do, you can help us keep the lights on in our office by making a gift to Daily Act. And I'll circle back to those upcoming events as we move into questions in case I moved too quickly on those. So thank you for letting me talk at you furiously about that. Yes. Yes, that's a good point. And typically so most of our events, especially throughout this pandemic period, we've been registration required. Petaluma Workday is an exception. You can just show up and we'll sign you. Thank you for pointing that. Yes. So native, there are kind of a few angles on it, right? Like you could make an argument that native plants are the best plant to have in your garden in general for so many reasons. They provide so many ecosystem benefits. But the main one, or the easiest one from the water perspective, is that native plants have co-evolved here with this ecosystem for millions of years. So even as we're having changes to rainfall pattern, climate change, they're still adapted to this kind of wet, dry, seasonal pattern, Mediterranean climate. So with that in mind, you can plant, for example, Mediterraneans, plants from climate analogs, but natives will be your best bet. And they'll sequester the most carbon. They provide the most food and shelter to the wildlife, pollinators. Exactly. There's so many that are, have grown in this Petaluma clay soil for time immemorial, and they're used to having water that doesn't. Yes. The 2-to-1 ratio. So if you remember, I wonder if I can cycle back to it quickly. There's that nice cross section back towards the beginning. Basically, you see how the sides are sloped as the water rises. So we have our level bottom and then we have our sloped sides. We want that to be that like the slope of that rise and run. So if you imagine this hill, we want it to be twice as wide as it is tall. So if you're going down 12 inches, you want your slope 24 inches long. So the high point to the low is 2 feet. So it's just like a direct line from your high point to where your low point begins. So if you see the little laser, basically from here to here. So if that were a triangle, you'd want this line to be twice as long as this is tall. Right. See a hand this way? Or Ava, do we have any questions on Zoom? No. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question. So something I didn't include, but that I should have thought with Petaluma, this would be a good thing to point out is you can always make the very bottom of your rain garden gravel, and you can put your you can replace your soil on top of gravel, right? So that that water will drain down to be not stagnant, standing water. So you could use DG, but I would recommend using something that's bigger. You know, DG breaks down pretty quickly, and that could actually have the opposite impact that we want, or it could run off. So gravel is great, but also just doing maybe like 30% compost. You excavate the soil that's clay heavy, and you figure out roughly 70-30 of your native soil compost should be effective. But doing that infiltration test will tell you a lot. Yep. Sure, sure. Yeah, so I would fortify it with rocks. Down at, like, you kind of build up a rock wall and then pack soil on top. And then I would do this at the tail end rainy season, and then plant things that will sink roots into that berm and hold it together. I would use larger rocks. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and then another great thing, if you do have that sloping, what you could do rather than a rain garden per se, you could do swales, kind of terrace thing. So if you remember in the video when they were showing they like cut out section, that can be really effective. Yeah, fair. All right. Mhm. Any other questions? If you have questions that come up after tonight, you're more than welcome to email Ava and myself, and we'll do our best to get answers to you. If you start the process and you run into a problem and you have you know, you have a question, you can give us a call or email us, and we can help you troubleshoot it. And if you need help, you decide you want this, but you don't want to do it yourself, we can refer a few local businesses to you that have a lot of experience. Yes. We do site visits through the Mulch Madness program. So if you have a lawn that has irrigation and you're going to convert it to a water-wise garden, if you get approved by the city, qualify for a free consultation with us. There will potentially be opportunities through Cool Petaluma that we're trying to work with Cool Petaluma block leaders to, with rain gardens and sheet mulching and potentially gray water systems, basically gather a group of people to volunteer install a bunch of them around the city. So that's a potential option to get a site with us too. But in general, we're not doing any like service stuff. But we do know some really knowledgeable and experienced people who can do that. One in particular, I think, does free consultations. Yeah, thank you all for being here. All right.